Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization. Let's talk about training principle number 3, fatigue management. The formal definition of fatigue management looks something like this. Stimulative training also brings with it fatigue. And that fatigue both disrupts the training process and disrupts the training outcome. I'll talk more about what that means in just a little bit. It also accumulates with time, so that problem gets worse. Thus, it needs to be addressed periodically for the best results to accrue. A more real-world definition, or kind of another way to look at it, is this. When you train hard, your body gets beat up and tired at various levels and in various systems and in various ways. Some of this fatigue dissipates very quickly, between sets, literally, and definitely a ton between workouts. But some of it hangs around between sessions and between workouts and between weeks and starts to add up, at first slowly and then more quickly. And that adding cumulative fatigue gets in the way of good results and of good training to cause even more good results. So you have to do two things. Add as little fatigue to the system as you have to in order to get good results. And also, because inevitably fatigue will still climb, though slower if you do a good job about not adding the excess of fatigue, as that fatigue inevitably gets too high, you have to take periods of time to bring it down back to relatively baseline levels so you have a clean slate to begin going again. The best analogy that I've ever made, in my opinion, on fatigue management is that of a restaurant kitchen. The purpose of a restaurant kitchen is to make amazing meals for the customers. That is the goal of the training, so to speak. But in the process of making the meals, food falls behind the stove, the rust develops, dishes get dirty, some appliances may break or malfunction. It's just a part of the cooking process. Have you ever seen someone cook and simultaneously clean? I've never seen it. What a disastrous waste of time that would be. So there's two elements to running a good kitchen with regard to fatigue management. One is don't try to make any more of a mess than you have to. So when you're pouring flour into a cup, don't just dump it in and have it go everywhere. Use a spout. It's not that hard. But also understand that even despite your best efforts, stuff's going to accumulate. A mess will be built. You don't want extra mess, but a mess still is built. Take a kitchen run by 4-year-olds versus a kitchen run by 24-year-olds. One of those is going to be a lot messier faster. Both groups of people, even the competent 24-year-olds, will have to occasionally do things that clean the kitchen, that bring the fatigue down. It is an inevitability of essentially some of the laws of thermodynamics. Entropy is a thing that happens, and it takes energy to reverse. So every now and again, you have to take time to reduce fatigue. The subcomponents of fatigue are twofold. There's acute fatigue, fatigue that literally results right during and after training. For example, when you'd finish a hard set of squats, you're fatigued. But that fatigue typically comes off between sets and certainly comes off between workouts. But then there is cumulative fatigue. Cumulative fatigue is the part of acute fatigue that doesn't get reduced, and it accumulates over time. And we have to have something special to deal with that kind of fatigue. Now, I have 6 points to give you to enhance your wisdom as a coach and as a trainer and as an athlete yourself on fatigue management. First, train in ways that give you the most stimulus, but for the smallest fatigue bang for the buck. That's called the stimulus to fatigue ratio. In further lectures, we will open that all up and close it back again. There's tons of stuff to talk about there. How that ratio is calculated is different depending on what you're doing, but generally it's get as much good stuff for as little bad stuff. A quick example, if you're using the leg press and there's a couple different places to put your feet in the places that hit your quads the most tension in your quads, the most burn, the most pump, and simultaneously pick a place for your feet that hurts your knees the least. That way you accumulate the least joint fatigue and do the most stimulating. So high SFR, high stimulus to fatigue ratio is kind of one of the offerings of the fatigue management principle that's a real golden platter type of thing. It's like, hey, why is fatigue management important? Because the SFR is such an incredible discovery that can only be made knowing the overload principle and the fatigue management principle at the same time. They unite together to make the SFR idea. Second, The way you designed your program from the get-go needs to try to hit a certain level of overloading stimulus. Fact, end of discussion. Any way you design your program that's not trying to get you the best stimulus is fucking stupid. But within that universe of very good training stimuli ideas, you also want to design your program from the get-go that in a way that doesn't accumulate any needless fatigue. Yes, it's very true that you can clean up fatigue later and should be cleaning it up and have to clean it up later anyway. But it's not true that because of that, you could just do whatever overload works. Yes, you have to clean up a kitchen regularly to keep it clean and good enough for an industrial sort of commercial restaurant standards. But that doesn't mean that when you make cookies, you just pour flour all over the fucking stove. Try to be as clean as you can, but at the same time, do a good job cooking. If you can be clean and do a good job cooking at the same time, amazing. As soon as your attempt at cleanliness, you're so careful pouring the flour into mini cups that you don't want any to spill, your cookies just timed out and they started to burn. So that's no good. Overload comes first. But if we can get a similar overload without excessive fatigue and minimizing it, we're in. That's a really, really great idea. Now, to that point, no matter how well you do this mitigation of needless fatigue accumulation, which is reflected in a maximum stimulus to fatigue ratio, you're still going to get accumulated fatigue. The search for the program or exercise or modality that causes no accumulated fatigue is a fool's errand. It doesn't happen. So at some point, you have to be ready in your program for the realization that a pursuit of best results necessitates fatigue accumulation and having to do something about it. Before I tell you how we're going to do something about it, I have to tell you what it is we're doing something about. Why is fatigue a problem? Why don't I just put more heavy metal in my headphones and grind through? 2 reasons. 1, higher levels of fatigue, for example, declining glycogen stores in your muscles, disruptions of the connectivity in your nervous system and the parts that go to your muscles, lead you to have performance problems. If your legs are going to grow from a set of 200 pounds in the squat, set of 10 for 200 pounds, they're going to grow their best because that's the maximum stimulus you can impart. What if you're so tired after multiple weeks of training that you can't get 200 for 10, you can only get 190 for 10? Will your legs grow as much? No. And if you continue to get more tired, at some point you're at 160 or 170 for 10, just exhausted. And there's no reason to keep going because you're outside of the stimulus threshold. That is actually our best core definition of what's called junk volume. When you are so tired that you can't even do the thing you're supposed to do anymore to the stimulus threshold, it's not good enough. Terrible analogy, but how long is it fun to have fun with someone physically in bed? If you're so sleepy and tired that you can't even make out anymore and you can't lift your hand to touch their body, it's time to go to sleep. Nobody's having any fun anymore. So the idea that training is so hard that eventually the fatigue builds up, you can't train as hard as, first of all, gives you optimal gains. And if you for some reason keep going for a long time, any gains at all, you're that beat up. So that's one big problem with fatigue, is it interferes with the very process of getting you better in training. Because training isn't just a thing where you show up and you get better. You have to perform at a high level. If you're fatigued, which is what fatigue does, is it drops your performance, that's a problem in and of itself. It's killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Is that a goose sound, Scott, the video guy?
It's a silly goose sound, yeah.
He's so silly, the silly goose. Now, there's another problem, because you can say to yourself, look, yes, I hear you, but I have headphones, metal, and caffeine, and I can go weeks longer than you think I can just on guts. And I hear that and I love it. Here's the problem, especially for hypertrophy and also in every other system. Fatigue isn't just a psychological thing that limits your performance. It's not just a physiological thing that limits your performance. At a biochemical level, as an example through the AMPK pathway, fatigue directly inhibits the muscle growth you get from any training session and exacerbates the muscle loss, the catabolism you get from any training session. Anytime you train two things happen. Anabolic mechanisms fire up, and because the training is quite damaging, you need to restructure your muscles. So the catabolic muscle breakdown mechanisms start to fire up so that they can pull the muscles apart and rebuild them better. Great. If you have high enough fatigue, at a biochemical level, it physically activates elements of fatigue, physically activate various proteins more that break down your muscle and inhibit the activation of proteins that build you up. What you can have here is an unmitigated clusterfuck of a disaster, where in week 6 of your program that you should have deloaded at week 5, you are metal, headphones, caffeine, still performing at a high level. Except every single one of those sessions that you just did, they used to cause this much muscle growth. Now they cause this. You get big balls, you go into week 7, now they cause this. The same level of effort. No, more effort and less gains. You keep going, you'll eventually cause as much catabolic activity as anabolic. You will have spent 2 hours in the gym every day for 6 days a week and got nothing for it. That is no good. This is why cumulative fatigue is so important. Yeah, fatigue makes you weaker and you have to take a break so you can be strong again. Sure, but motivation, psychology, and Instagram quotes, and you're back in the gym. Instagram quotes do not leach in to your biochemistry. And thus it is imperative that fatigue be kept to a certain lower level than maximum. You could think, okay, fatigue's really bad. Thanks, Dr. Mike, you scared the living shit out of me. What if I just don't train that hard? What if I train so easy that it doesn't accumulate fatigue? In reality, when you're a beginner in the first few weeks, maybe even a few months of your training, through the magic of noob training, you actually can gain muscle and strength without a notable rise in cumulative fatigue. Ta-da, amazing. However, beyond very early noob status, that is no longer a possibility. The overload threshold starts to not be anything regarding you lifting weights, and it starts to shrink up to something that's challenging. And then, if it's challenging enough to make you grow, it's going to be challenging enough to your systems to fatigue them. So if you make training so easy that fatigue never accumulates, it's too easy to give you the best results, and at some point too easy to give you any results. Training has to be hard to get you gains. But because that accumulates fatigue, no matter how good you are at minimizing how much fatigue it accumulates through good stimulus to fatigue ratio exercise selection, good practices, good sleep, good food that keep the fatigue lower than it normally would be, it still goes up. Because it still goes up, you have to include regular episodes via which you reduce fatigue in your training back to lower levels from which you have more runway to continue more stimulative training. There are a few categories of training structure which describe this process. You can take off days, days in which you don't train. I recommend at least one every single week for everyone, often two. Recovery sessions. You were going to come in and go hard. Now you come in and you basically take everything and slash it by half. Half the volume, half the load, half the reps, more than half the reps in reserve. And your body heals a ton and it reduces fatigue, and you can come back next time stronger. If you need more tender love and care, you take a whole recovery half week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday normally is push, legs, pull for you. Now it's push recovery, legs recovery, and pull recovery. Everything goes to a recovery session for an entire half a week. That's big. That can buy you another week and a half, up to 2.5 weeks of more progressive training. It's a great thing to use if you're in the middle of a mesocycle with a client and they're like got extra fatigued. You're like, shit, still have 3 weeks to go. Why don't we take a recovery half week and then you'll be golden to finish it off. All the recovery half weeks in the world cannot add up to really reducing a ton of fatigue, because a lot of the times joint and connective tissue fatigue and deep psychological fatigue just doesn't go away in 3 or 4 days. For that, you need deloads. Deloads are essentially recovery sessions, really are recovery sessions that don't last half a week or a single session. They last a whole week typically, and they do a lot of work. They still don't reduce fatigue completely, however, especially at the joint connective tissue level, especially at the psychological level of like training is still hard, and that accumulates. So every 6 months to a year, most people and most of your clients will need at least 2 weeks of sequential, easy training or no training at all usually one deload week, and then an extra week completely off. And that is called an active rest phase. 1 to 2 of those a year brings fatigue essentially back to kind of what you started before you ever started lifting weights. And then not only do you get a huge runway of multiple months of incredible training from that, but you get to heal up all the little injuries, little aches and pains, and build a ton of anabolic sensitivity because you're no longer in a position where you are like resistance training. Oh my God, 2 weeks of no training. You do a 1 set of curls, you get sore for 3 days. That's exactly where you want to be. Anyway, that's fatigue management. See you guys next time for, I think, variation or SRA. Who knows? See you then.